1945. The war was over, but for thousands of German prisoners, the silence that followed the final gunfire felt heavier than the bombs that had fallen across Europe. A grey dawn broke over the American camp in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Rows of weary faces, women in tattered uniforms, their eyes sunken from hunger and exhaustion, stood quietly, unsure what awaited them. The journey from chaos to captivity had been long and bitter. They expected punishment, hunger, humiliation, everything they'd been taught to fear about the enemy. But what came next shattered everything they believed. A whistle blew, the gates creaked open, and instead of shouts or rifles came the smell: warm bread, roasted meat, coffee. The aroma swept through the camp like a dream, pulling them forward in disbelief. The women exchanged nervous glances, clutching their worn coats tighter. One of them whispered, "They're feeding us." When they reached the mess hall, the sight froze them in place. An orderly line of American cooks serving hot food with calm, respectful eyes. No taunts, no cruelty. Just steaming plates of mashed potatoes, thick gravy, and fresh vegetables. Some of the women trembled as they accepted the trays. Others lowered their eyes, ashamed to feel hunger before former enemies. And when the first taste touched their lips, simple, warm, human, they began to cry. Tears that had been held back through the destruction of cities, the loss of brothers, and the end of their homeland finally fell over a plate of food. The trucks rolled through the gates just after sunrise. Their engines sputtered and coughed as if even the machines were weary of war. Inside, the women sat in silence, their faces pale from exhaustion, their eyes hollow from months of uncertainty. Dust clung to their uniforms and hair, and the faint smell of sweat and smoke lingered in the air. No one spoke. Words had lost their meaning somewhere between surrender and survival. Every bump in the road reminded them of what they had lost. Homes reduced to ashes, families scattered, a world that no longer existed. When the convoy finally slowed, the women lifted their heads. Ahead, through the morning haze, they saw rows of fences, neat and straight, and beyond them, wooden barracks. It didn't look like the prison camps they had imagined from the stories whispered in Germany. There were no screaming guards, no dogs straining on leashes, no gunshots echoing in the distance. Just quiet order. The truck stopped with a hiss, and the guards, American soldiers in pressed uniforms, approached. One of the women instinctively braced herself, clutching the small satchel she had managed to keep. She expected the butt of a rifle, a shout in a foreign language. But instead, the nearest guard simply nodded and gestured for them to step down. The first to climb out hesitated, her boots touching the ground like she was testing whether it was safe to stand. The guard extended a hand, not roughly, but firmly, to help her down. She blinked in disbelief, unsure how to react. Another woman followed, then another, each expecting the illusion to break, each finding only calm faces and quiet gestures. The guard's eyes did not carry hatred. They carried something else, fatigue, perhaps, or pity, or the simple duty of men who were done with fighting. The women stood in a line, clutching their belongings. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and clear, a strange kind of blue they hadn't seen in years. They exchanged uncertain glances. Some tried to stand straight, recalling the discipline drilled into them during the war, but most were too tired to care. A few soldiers guided them toward the camp gates, speaking softly in English words they barely understood. Their tone, however, needed no translation. It was patient, not cruel. As they passed through the gates, the women noticed the differences immediately. The camp was organized, almost peaceful. The barrack stood evenly spaced, each with small windows and tidy steps. Laundry hung from lines between buildings, fluttering gently in the morning breeze. There were trees, tall, green, and alive, something that had disappeared from the bombed landscapes of Europe. Birds sang from the branches, and the sound felt almost unreal, like an echo from another life. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they were not surrounded by rubble or the stench of burning cities. It was too calm, too clean. They didn't know whether to trust it. An American officer stepped forward, holding a clipboard. He spoke with authority, but without aggression, instructing the women where to go, where to place their belongings, and how to line up for registration. His voice carried no malice, just procedure. One by one, they gave their names, their ages, their ranks. Some hesitated, unsure whether honesty was safe, but the Americans seemed unconcerned. They wrote quickly, nodded, and moved them along. One young woman, no more than 20, stood trembling as she faced the soldier behind the desk. Her hands shook as she handed over her papers. The soldier glanced up and offered a brief, polite smile. She didn't know what to make of it. No man had smiled at her like that since before the war. She nodded, unsure if she should return it, and moved on. After registration, they were led toward a barrack marked with a white sign. Inside, rows of metal bunks stood neatly against the walls. Each bed had a folded blanket, a thin pillow, and a small wooden locker beside it. It was simple, but it was more than most of them had expected. One of the women muttered in disbelief, "Clean sheets." Another whispered, "Is this a trick?" But the Americans didn't seem to be playing tricks. The guards moved quietly through the room, showing them where the latrines were, where they could wash. Some handed out soap and small towels. The women stared at the bars of soap in their hands as though holding something precious. A few smiled faintly, unable to help themselves. Others broke down in quiet sobs, hiding their faces so no one would see. When they were alone again, the silence inside the barrack grew heavy. They sat on their bunks, staring at the floor or out the small windows where sunlight spilled through in warm, steady lines. No one spoke for a long while. Each woman was lost in her own thoughts. Memories of air raids, the cries of children, the last glimpse of home. Some thought of husbands who would never return, others of brothers still missing somewhere in the ruins. And yet, here they were, alive, breathing, and strangely safe. Outside, an American soldier was sweeping near the mess hall. The sound of the broom scraping across the ground seemed oddly peaceful. Two more soldiers walked by, talking quietly, their laughter low and human. It struck the women how normal it all seemed. These were the men they had been taught to hate, the men who had bombed their cities. And yet here they were, maintaining a camp where even the prisoners were treated with a kind of respect. As afternoon came, the sun warmed the air. The camp dogs lay lazily near the fences, their tails flicking back and forth. The women gathered near the window, curious. They saw American prisoners, men from the other side, playing ball near the far field, laughing, relaxed. It was not the image they had imagined of war's aftermath. One of the German women whispered, "Do they really treat us like this?" Another replied softly, Maybe the war is truly over." Still, not all could accept it. One older woman, her face hardened by years of discipline, refused to sit. "Don't forget who they are," she warned. This could change any moment. But her words carried no conviction, and even she seemed unsure. The tension of fear and disbelief hung between them like smoke that refused to clear. As night approached, the camp lights flickered on, glowing softly against the darkening sky. The women lay on their bunks, too restless to sleep. Outside, crickets chirped. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear faint music, a radio playing from the guards' quarters. A familiar melody, slow and haunting, drifted through the cool night air. It wasn't a German song, but its warmth reached them all the same. One woman turned her face to the wall and wept silently. Another whispered a prayer. By morning, the air was crisp and cold again. The women rose slowly, adjusting to a new rhythm they didn't yet understand. They were still prisoners, but something had shifted. There was no hatred here, no revenge. Only the quiet efficiency of a nation that had moved beyond the fight. For the first time, they began to sense that captivity might not mean cruelty. When a soldier passed by with a pot of hot water for washing, several women instinctively stepped back. But he merely nodded, placed it down, and moved on. They watched him go, the steam curling upward in the morning sun. One woman murmured, almost to herself, "They treat us like people." Another answered, "Perhaps that's what peace looks like." Outside, the camp awoke to life. The sound of boots on gravel, of distant chatter and clinking tin cups, filled the air. The women gathered near the doorway, breathing in the clean scent of pine trees that surrounded the camp. The same trees that had seemed alien yesterday now felt protective, like silent witnesses to something changing deep within them. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. The fear was still there, but it had softened into confusion, into fragile hope. And in that fragile hope lay the first seed of what was to come. The moment that would stay with them forever. When compassion would cross the line between enemies and turn strangers into something more human than any flag or uniform could define. The morning came quietly, with a thin mist rolling over the camp like a soft blanket. The women stirred from their bunks to the faint clatter of metal trays and the smell, something they hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. The air carried it in waves, warm, rich and inviting. Bacon, eggs, coffee. For a moment, no one dared to believe it. They sat up slowly, glancing toward the door, wondering if it was real or some cruel trick of the imagination. After all, the war had left them suspicious of everything good. Hope, they had learned, could hurt more than hunger. Then a bell rang outside, a sharp, steady clang that echoed through the camp. The sound startled them. The younger women looked at one another nervously, unsure what it meant. A few older ones whispered, "Mess call." That word, mess, meant something different in their minds. It meant army food, ration scraps, boiled water with floating grains of barley. But the smell in the air was different. This was something rich, something generous. A guard appeared at the door, motioning for them to line up. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't waving his rifle. He just gestured calmly and said a few short words they barely understood. "Breakfast. This way." His voice was even, almost polite. The women exchanged uncertain looks. They didn't trust it, not yet. One of them muttered, "Breakfast. For us?" But the line began to form anyway, slow and cautious, boots crunching on the gravel as they stepped outside. The sun had risen higher now, burning through the mist and casting soft gold light over the camp. Dew sparkled on the fences and grass. Birds darted between the pine branches overhead. The quiet was surreal, so unlike the chaos of bombed cities they had left behind. They followed the line toward the mess hall. their steps uncertain but drawn forward by the impossible aroma that grew stronger with every breath. When they reached the entrance, they stopped in awe. The building was simple, a wooden hall with open windows and a long line of tables inside, but to them, it looked like something out of a dream. The smell of cooked food poured out through the doorway, thick and comforting. For women who had survived on thin soup and moldy bread crusts, the scent itself was enough to make their eyes sting. Inside, American cooks were already at work. They wore white aprons, stained slightly with grease, their movements practiced and efficient. Some laughed quietly among themselves as they served, while others concentrated on filling each tray with care. There was no mockery, no scorn. They didn't seem to look at the prisoners as enemies, just as people waiting to eat. The women hesitated at the door, unsure if they were supposed to enter. The guard standing nearby nodded. "Go on," he said softly. One by one, they stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath their boots. The line moved slowly. Each woman carried a tin tray handed to her at the entrance. The first station served scrambled eggs, real eggs, yellow and steaming. The next gave 2 strips of bacon, crisp and glistening. Then came a scoop of mashed potatoes, a ladle of gravy, and a slice of soft white bread still warm from the oven. At the end of the line, another cook poured black coffee into small cups. The women could barely breathe. It was more food than most of them had seen in months. Their eyes darted from the food to the faces of the men serving it, searching for a trick, a sneer, some hint of cruelty hidden behind this kindness. But there was none. Only quiet professionalism. One cook caught a woman's hesitant stare and gave a short nod as if to say, "It's all right." When the first woman reached the end of the line, she didn't move. She just stood there, tray trembling in her hands. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came. The cook raised his eyebrows gently. "Sit," he said, pointing toward the tables. She nodded quickly, her eyes wet, and moved to an empty seat. Soon the hall filled with the clatter of trays and the soft scrape of chairs. The women sat together, unsure what to do. Some stared at their food without touching it, afraid to believe it was truly theirs. Others picked up their forks with shaking hands, eyes darting nervously toward the guards along the walls. Then, somewhere down the table, one woman finally took a bite. Just a small one, a taste of mashed potatoes with a trace of gravy. She froze, eyes wide. The warmth spread through her like something holy. She closed her eyes, swallowed, and let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a sob. Her neighbor looked at her confused, then took a bite herself. Within moments, the silence broke. Forks began to move. Steam rose into the air. The sound of chewing and quiet weeping filled the room. Some of the women ate slowly, reverently, as if afraid the meal would vanish if they hurried. Others devoured it, tears streaming freely as they realized it wasn't going to be taken away. For the first time in years, the hunger in their bodies wasn't met with fear or shame. It was simply being answered. At the far end of the room, an American officer stood watching quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make a speech. He just observed the moment. The fragile, human stillness that had replaced the noise of war. One of his men leaned close and whispered, "They're crying." The officer nodded, eyes distant. "Let them," he said softly. Across the tables, the German women began to talk in low voices. Not about war or loss, but about simple things, about bread, about their mothers' kitchens, about memories of mornings before everything changed. One woman lifted her cup of coffee and inhaled deeply. "It smells like home," she whispered. Her hands trembled so much she had to set it down. Another nodded. "I haven't tasted this since 1942, she said, her voice breaking. The cooks continued serving, moving down the line with trays of refills. When one woman tried to refuse a second portion, shaking her head, the cook smiled faintly and said, "Eat. There's plenty." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She took the plate with both hands, tears blurring her vision. The light through the windows grew brighter, turning the steam from the food into soft golden clouds. Dust motes danced in the air. The entire hall seemed to glow with warmth, something between sunlight and mercy. For a moment, the war outside the barbed wire didn't exist. There were no enemies, no victors, no defeated. There were just people and the simple act of one side feeding the other. Near the end of the meal, one young woman looked down at her empty plate and began to cry quietly. Her shoulders shook, but she made no sound. The woman beside her reached out, placing a hand on her arm. "It's all right," she whispered. But the younger one shook her head. "It's not," she managed to say through tears. "They were supposed to hate us. Why don't they?" The older woman had no answer. Outside, the guards leaned against the walls, watching the women through the windows. They didn't look like jailers. Their faces were tired, their eyes soft. A few exchanged quiet words about their own families back home. One young guard murmured, "My sister's about their age." The thought hung in the air, unspoken but shared by all. The war had made enemies out of people who might have otherwise been neighbors. Inside, the women began to relax. The tension in their shoulders eased. Laughter, a fragile, hesitant laughter, broke out at one of the tables when a piece of bread slipped into a cup of coffee. The sound startled everyone at first, then spread like ripples in water. It was the first laughter many of them had heard in months, and it carried something cleansing in it. By the time the meal ended, the atmosphere in the hall had changed completely. The women no longer looked at their guards with suspicion. Some even offered quiet nods of gratitude. When the Americans collected the trays, a few women whispered thank you in broken English. The soldiers, unsure how to respond, simply nodded back, their expressions soft and unreadable. As the women filed out, the sunlight hit their faces. They squinted, shielding their eyes, and breathed in the crisp morning air. Their stomachs were full, but it was more than that. Something invisible had shifted inside them. It wasn't just food that they had been given. It was a glimpse of something beyond hate, beyond orders and propaganda. It was humanity, unexpected and disarming. For many of them, that meal would become a memory that refused to fade. Years later, when they spoke of their captivity, they would recall that first breakfast as the moment their fear began to dissolve. It was the day they began to understand that mercy could exist even in the ruins of war. The guards watched them walk back to their barracks, the morning sun glinting off the fences. The smell of coffee still lingered in the air. One soldier, leaning on the doorframe of the mess hall, lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Never thought I'd see something like that," he murmured. His friend nodded, staring after the women. "Maybe that's how peace starts," he said quietly. And perhaps it did, there in that modest wooden hall, where enemies shared a meal and found something unexpected waiting between them, forgiveness. The hall had grown quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the stillness that comes when emotion fills a room so completely that no one dares to disturb it. The sound of clinking forks and murmured voices had faded. Only the soft hum of the ceiling fan remained, turning slowly, rhythmically, as if marking the fragile heartbeat of peace itself. The women sat at the long wooden tables, their trays half empty, the steam from their meals still rising faintly into the cool morning air. For a few long moments, no one spoke. Each woman stared down at her plate, lost in thought, in memory, in something too deep to name. The scent of coffee and bread still hung around them, mingled now with something human, something raw and wordless. Then, quietly, one woman began to tremble. Her fork slipped from her hand and clattered softly against the metal tray. She didn't move to pick it up. She just stared at it, her lips pressed tightly together as her eyes filled with tears. The woman beside her reached out instinctively, her voice a whisper. "Was it loss? What's wrong?" But she already knew the answer. The first tear fell soundlessly, rolling down the prisoner's dirt-streaked cheek, leaving a clean line through the grime. She covered her mouth, trying to stifle the sob that followed. It came anyway, breaking the stillness like a fragile glass shattering. Across the table, another woman began to cry. Then another soon. The quiet was no longer quiet. It was the soft sound of a dozen hearts breaking open all at once. These were not loud cries, not the cries of despair they had known so well during the war. These were tears of release, the kind that come when the soul, after years of being held hostage by fear and hate, finally lets go. They were crying because they didn't understand how kindness could come from those they were told were monsters. They were crying because they could finally taste safety, and it was too much to bear. One woman clenched her hands in her lap, the skin on her knuckles white. She had seen her city burn, had buried her brother beneath rubble, had carried wounded soldiers through mud and gunfire. She had not cried then. But now, with a plate of food before her and no one yelling, no bombs falling, no hunger gnawing at her insides, she broke. The dam inside her burst, and the tears came freely, shaking her entire body. The fork lay forgotten beside her tray, glinting faintly in the light that filtered through the window. Across the hall, one of the American cooks noticed. He paused, ladle in hand, watching the scene quietly. He didn't say anything, didn't approach. There was nothing to say. What could words add to something so profound, so quietly human? He just stood there, hands resting on the counter, his brow furrowed in empathy. Another soldier at the door saw it too. He shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to look away or bear witness. Finally, he leaned to his companion and murmured, "They're crying." His friend nodded slowly, eyes on the women. "They've earned it," he said simply. For the women, the tears came in waves. Some wept openly, shoulders shaking, their hands pressed to their faces. Others cried silently, their eyes glistening but their expressions calm, as if they were mourning something deep within. Their youth, their lost families, the years consumed by hate. A few simply sat still, staring into the distance, eyes glazed with memories too painful to recall aloud. No one told them to stop. The guards did not intervene. The Americans understood that this was not weakness. This was something sacred, a moment of surrender far deeper than any signed document could express. This was the human heart, stripped bare after too many years of war. One of the women, her blonde hair streaked with dust and age far beyond her years, lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was steady. "Do you smell that?" She whispered to the woman beside her, a faint, trembling smile on her lips. "It smells like my mother's kitchen." Her companion nodded wordlessly, unable to reply. Another woman, sitting near the window, traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. "I used to think they were monsters," she said softly. "That's what we were told." Her friend beside her gave a faint, tearful laugh. "So did I. But monsters don't cook eggs this way." They both smiled through their tears, small, trembling smiles that carried years of exhaustion and revelation. Outside, sunlight spilled through the windows, cutting through the soft haze in golden beams. Dust motes swirled in the light like tiny stars. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying in the distant scent of pine and earth. It felt like the world was breathing again, after holding its breath for too long. For the first time since being captured, the women did not feel watched as prisoners. They felt seen as people. There was no triumph in the Americans' eyes, no need to humiliate, no desire for revenge. That simple lack of hatred was enough to unmake everything the women had believed about the enemy. One of them, an older woman with sharp, weary eyes, finally spoke, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Do you think they lost people too?" The question hung in the air. The others looked at her, then nodded slowly. Of course they had, every side had. For a moment, the divide between victor and defeated blurred into something simpler, something universal: grief. The hall was filled with the scent of cooling food, the soft rustle of clothing, the quiet sniffling of tears drying. The women sat in that silence for what felt like hours, unwilling to leave, unwilling to let the moment end. In their hearts, something unfamiliar had begun to take root. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was the beginning of forgiveness, fragile and tentative like the first sprout pushing through ashes. Eventually, an American officer entered the hall. His boots clicked softly on the floorboards, the sound carrying a weight of quiet authority. The women stiffened instinctively, but he did not shout or bark orders. Instead, he removed his cap, holding it respectfully at his side. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the tear-streaked faces, the half-finished plates, the silence heavy with emotion. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his words were simple. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said. His accent was thick, but his tone was gentle. "The war is over." Some of the women began to cry again quietly. Others looked down, their expressions unreadable. The officer nodded once, placed his cap back on, and turned to leave. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, and when the door closed behind him, it was as if a line had been drawn between what was and what could be. Outside, the camp was alive with ordinary sounds. The clang of metal, the murmur of conversation, the distant laughter of soldiers on break. But inside that mess hall, something extraordinary had happened. The women didn't fully understand it yet, but they could feel it. Something invisible had shifted, something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. One of the younger women looked around the room, wiping her eyes. "If only my brother could see this," she whispered. "He would never believe it." Another nodded. "None of us would have." In the years to come, many of them would remember that morning, the smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight on their hands, the sound of quiet weeping, and they would tell their children and grandchildren that mercy had a face, and it was not the one they had been taught to hate. When the guards finally called for them to leave, the women rose slowly, gathering their trays. The clatter of metal seemed louder now, almost jarring after so much silence. They walked in single file toward the exit, their movements measured and calm. At the door, one of them paused and turned back for a final look. The tables were still covered with half-eaten eaten meals, the sunlight painting everything in soft gold. She took a deep breath, memorizing it, the smell, the warmth, the peace, and then stepped out into the cool air. The camp stretched before them, its fences gleaming in the light. But the barbed wire no longer seemed as menacing. The guards who stood watch no longer seemed like enemies. For the first time since being captured, the women felt something close to freedom. Freedom of the heart, not of the body. They walked back to their barracks without speaking, each lost in her own thoughts. Some smiled faintly, others wiped their eyes. And though none of them said it aloud, they all carried the same understanding that kindness, even from an enemy, has the power to rebuild what war destroys. That day in a quiet American camp far from home, mercy had broken through the ruins of hatred. And it had done so not with speeches or battles, but with food, warmth and tears.